good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's Digging In with TPS-MTSU. Today, we are going to be talking about the free press and its role as the fourth estate. As we get started today, just a couple quick things before we jump into our content. If you would, please keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. This will help us keep a clear audio because we are recording this session for inclusion on our YouTube channel. If you would, if you've not already done so, rename yourself. And then remember that we do want these sessions to be interactive for those participating live. So do go ahead and open up your chat box. Feel free to make comments, ask questions throughout the presentation. We will be responding to those throughout. And then also know that you can use the reaction buttons. So we have hands clapping or thumbs up. So again, if you have questions, thoughts, you can also use those. We will not be doing any polling today, but that is something that we would do occasionally make use of. And then just a reminder for those of you who've been in some of our past sessions, or if you've not been to one of ours before, we do have a Padlet for this webinar series. And on that Padlet, you will find links to all of the videos from all of these sessions, the link to our post survey that we'll talk about at the end, and then the resources from each of the sessions that we have done. So that's a great way to go and find all the PowerPoints, the links, all that kind of stuff in one place. So you can access that through either the web address here or the QR code that we have. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Stacey Graham, who's going to talk to us a little bit about our theme for this month.
Thank you, Kira. I am going to share my screen so we can take a closer look at the newsletter. Okay, so can everyone see the newsletter all right? All right, good. We have never done a newsletter on the topic of the press before, even though we have worked a lot of press-related types of issues and topics into a lot of our previous materials. We love using newspaper sources. We love using Chronicling America. But this month, we thought we'd just take a closer look at what it means to have a free press, which of course means taking a look at the very First Amendment to the Constitution. So for starters, though, I could have chosen nothing better for our awesome source of the month than what is considered to be the first political cartoon, and is definitely the most famous political cartoon created in America by one of the earliest and most well-known champions of the free press in America, Benjamin Franklin. Not only did he champion the free press, he himself had a printing press, and you can see it right here. This is a model of it in his house, and here's, it's got a very long title to it, but here's a closer look at this awesome reproduction printing press, which would have been very similar to the way printing presses had looked at this point for 200 years. But yeah, so Benjamin Franklin is credited with Join or Die. Now this, people think, is about the American Revolution, but it's actually associated originally with the French and Indian War. It came out in 1754, but it of course was brought back up during the Revolution when talking about the unity of the colonies. And it's obviously had quite an impact since then. But looking at our blurb, talking about the freedom of the press. Now, it's one of the four enshrined freedoms of the very First Amendment. And basically, this is hyperlinked to the actual First Amendment at the Constitution from the Library of Congress's website, congress.gov. So this says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's the first freedom, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And then, or of the right of people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's actually 5 freedoms enshrined, excuse me. With the freedom of the press being the third one. Now, it doesn't really get into details here. If you want to get into details, you can always click on First Amendment annotated, and read more about it in exhausting detail, but we're not going to do that today. So what does it mean to have a free press, and how did that get hammered out early on, and how does it play out throughout our history as different interpretations of this get promulgated and challenged at the court level, and of course in the court of public opinion. This also will link to a bunch of the court cases, because we are going to be talking about those a little bit in this issue of freedom of the press. And starting with the very first one, the John Peter Zenger trial, which is what I'm going to be featuring in just a couple minutes. And then I link to this documentary, which it's pretty lengthy, but the first 14 minutes of it are talking about the history of the freedom of the press in America, and then it gets into the details of the Zenger trial after that point. And so the whole thing is really valuable and really well done. It's from the Annenberg Center, which is has really good public resources. And so we're going to explore a lot of these resources in this webinar, but I just want to show you our lesson ideas that we did: the free press in early America, which I'm going to come back to in a second, the free press and Japanese internment. There's a lesson on the fairness doctrine. And then one on reporting world events, which brings in the world history curriculum standards as well as American history. And then on page 4, which we always like to throw interesting things into, further primary sources about free press at internment camps, looking at Frederick Douglass as a newspaper publisher. I mean, that man did it all. Yellow journalism at the turn of the 19th century. And then another landmark Supreme Court case in terms of the right of the press, which is the New York Times versus the United States. This is one that is specifically mentioned in the US history standards. And this is also one that is discussed at the end of that documentary that I mentioned. So this is the same one that's linked to from the first page. Okay, so what we're going to be taking a deep dive into is this first lesson idea, talking about the free press in early America. And there aren't any specific 8th grade history standards that talk about this explicitly, but so much of the context surrounding early printing does come up while you're teaching 8th grade. And so this may be something that you can work in, or at least parts of, for those 8th grade history teachers. But it's definitely something that could be used in government and civics classes, as well as contemporary issues, which I think it goes for the other ones in this issue as well. This is definitely more government and civics centered than it is just traditional history centered. So the first paragraph of this lesson idea is talking about kind of early printing in general, as well as early newspapers in the United States. And there's actually a very good exhibition that's online at the Library of Congress that talks about those things. And I'm going to show you really quickly. It's called First Among Many, and it's about the Bay Psalm book and early moments in American printing. The Bay Psalm book is the first book that is thought to have been printed in the United States, and it's a book of Psalms, so it's actually a religious book. It's not like a newspaper or anything like that. So this talks about, this provides a lot of really good context for early printing. It talks about the first printing press that's thought to have been brought to America, was apparently brought by an Englishman and his wife, the Glovers, in 1638. And of course, these printing presses are giant machines with lots of parts. And of course, you have to have paper too. So the establishment of printing press is going to lead to the establishment of paper mills and other kinds of things in America. So this will become a very important sector of the trades economy in 17th and 18th century America. And then of course you have to have the typeface, which God, it'd be great if I had some material culture examples of that right now, but alas, I do not. But he died, and so his widow Elizabeth is actually the one who brought it to shore, and she started printing with it, and she had an apprentice, Stephen Day, and then he's the one who is credited with this very first book. And then it links to the beginning of a free press. And this is a really nice little blurb that can introduce your students to the John Peter Zenger case, because he's a German immigrant, and he's in New York, because the first printing was largely in Massachusetts, and it was largely religious in nature. And then printing took off after that in places like New York and Pennsylvania, where it became a lot more civic focused as well, and newspapers started to come out. And so you have these political newspapers, because newspapers started off with a very, very clear political bias, and that was their whole point. And in fact, the lesson idea talks about that the idea of objectivity among the news media isn't really something that gets fully developed as we know it today until the 20th century. And so, it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're reading newspapers from like the Civil War, they clearly had a Union or Confederate bias to them, and that's something your students have to take into consideration. But that doesn't mean that there was no such concept before. It just means it wasn't as fully developed like we know it today. Because starting in about the 1830s, you have this penny press, and it's called that because the issues were so cheap. They were like a penny a piece, where there was this movement to start printing facts. Because the idea is, if you inform your citizens with facts, they can use their own critical thinking skills to evaluate these facts and come to the right conclusions for themselves. And I think that's the ideal behind all media today. But as we know, things have gotten really murky. Yeah, maybe maybe you can't trust the media to do that. And maybe you can't trust the readers to actually use their critical thinking skills as much. But hopefully your students will be learning to do this, right? In a good world. Okay. And so this is a case, the Zenger case. It predates the United States itself. So this isn't even the first case of the United States in terms of the free press, because it took place in the 1730s, before the US was even a country. So this is a colonial case, but it's going to become precedent. And of course, it's going to become very notorious. So you have this newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal. And what is it critical of? It's critical of the royal governor of New York, a man named William Cosby. So is constantly launching political criticisms against him. And Zenger is actually, he's not the author of these criticisms. He's just the printer. But yet he's the one who gets sued. And he's sued for something called seditious libel. So you're going to want to explain to your students what seditious libel is, and see if they know what libel is and what the difference is between libel and slander. So give me in the chat box, if you will, your best definition of what libel is and what seditious libel might mean.
So we have sedition, treason. I think of libel as damaging statements that are false.
All right, good. Yes, so sedition, of course, is related to treason. And of course, this would be treason against the crown, as in Great Britain, the colonial power. And then libel, that's when you supposedly say something damaging against somebody in print. Whereas slander is where you say something damaging against somebody just kind of like out loud. And so that's the kind of crux of the case here. And you can actually, where are we? Okay, so I'm just going to click on this and show you really quickly that there's a really good discussion of what seditious libel means in the First Amendment Encyclopedia, which Kira will show you more in depth later. But this is a good thing to show to your students when you're trying to discuss what this means, which is very important that they understand, that they have a good understanding of the concept before they can even get into these cases. So yes. Now there are a couple contextual pieces that are linked to here. One of them is a Today in History article from the Library of Congress talking about James Delancey, who was a lawyer who presided over this case. And so you can see it's a good write-up of, you know, what was the problem with Cosby, why was Cosby suing, and then what were the kind of details of the case. And so when they're talking about Hamilton, who is Zenger's lawyer, it's not Alexander Hamilton. This is Andrew Hamilton, somebody that we've never heard of before, but just so your students don't get confused, because the other court case in this lesson idea does involve Alexander Hamilton, the one that we love to sing his name. Anyway, and the other write-up is a bit more extensive. So this might, if you had more time for your students, or if you yourself wanted to get into further details, this is the Historical Society of New York Courts. So, I mean, that's where the whole thing happened. And so this is a really good website to find details about this case. And not only that, yeah, it's a bit of a longer write-up, but it's still pretty, it's, not any longer than reading a Wikipedia article. But the cool thing is it has the whole PDF of the trial linked at the bottom. Now that PDF is not transcribed. It is what it looked like back in 1735. So it's like a really long PDF of an 18th century looking newspaper. And don't worry, because we have excerpts that are transcribed in a worksheet that's linked from this lesson idea that I'll show you in a minute. It just takes a while to upload, as you can tell. I should have already done that. But yeah, this is not something you're going to want to throw at your students. I'm just showing you where it was located and where I got it. So it's only 33 pages, but reading it requires being familiar just with kind of the conventions of 18th century print, which your students may or may not be. I find this pretty easy, but I'm really used to S's that look like F's. But anyway, we'll get back to this in a second. So we have those two different contextual pieces where your students can read summaries of the case. So it's, what is the case, what happens? And basically, the whole point is that, oh, well, it's libel, and that's what he's being sued for. But if libel means something that's untrue, then he's not guilty if what he's saying is true. So that was the whole defendant's basis for this case. And they actually won. So that is the first case that this looks at. And then it also introduces another case that's also centers around the addition the idea of libel. And that one is lesser known. It's called People versus Croswell. So this case is not going to be listed in the standards by name, but it's important because this is an early republic challenge to that very idea of freedom of the press. And so here it's coming back up. And so what are they going to say now that the United States is actually an established nation? And so again, there's a really nice summary of this case. It's very easy to read. Your students will have no problem with any of this contextual pieces. And then there's some primary source excerpts. So we're going to look at that right now. So this is the worksheet that we created to go along with this lesson idea. We've got 2 excerpts from the Zenger case, and then 2 excerpts from the Croswell case. And so basically, I had a lot of fun, and I'm not saying that in a sarcastic way at all, reading through the 33 pages of this court case, because it was really fun to read. And at one point, the lawyer was talking about the excessive merriment on the part of the people in the courtroom, and I just like, wow, they're really into this too. But anyway, so I've condensed what I thought were the most important points down into 2 excerpts. So basically, the first one, he's saying, you know, may it please your honor, I cannot agree with Mr. Attorney, for though I freely acknowledge that there are such things as libel, yet I must insist at the same time that what my client is charged with is not a libel. And I observed just now that Mr. Attorney, in defining a libel, made use of the words scandalous, seditious, and tend to disquiet the people, but he omitted the word false. So in other words, he's saying, you know, my client didn't say anything false, you know, so therefore you really have no basis to be using this word libel against him. And then this, of course, that's the specifics of the case. And then, of course, there's always the larger point, which is freedom of the press. And why is it so important? So that's what's elaborated in the second excerpt. But to conclude, the question before the court and you, gentlemen of the jury, is not of small or private concern, and it is not the cause of a poor printer, nor of New York alone, which you are trying. No, it may in its consequence affect every free man that lives under a British government on the main of America. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty. And I make no doubt, but your upright conduct this day will not only entitle you to the love and esteem of your fellow citizens, but every man who prefers freedom to a life of slavery will bless and honor you as men who have baffled the attempt of tyranny, and by an impartial and uncorrupt verdict have laid a noble foundation for securing to ourselves, our posterity, and our neighbors that to which nature and the laws of our country have given us a right, the liberty both of exposing and opposing arbitrary power in these parts of the world, at least, by speaking and writing truth. So this is establishing right here why you need a free press. You need a free press to expose and oppose arbitrary power. And that is where the idea of the fourth estate comes in. You know, you have a fourth branch of government that's supposed to keep the other ones in check by exposing what it does and making it transparent for the people. And so that's kind of being claimed here before we even have a United States of America. So this idea of what the free press means predates the First Amendment. So you can see that they would have had this in mind when they're writing that First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And I don't have time to really get into the details of the People versus Croswell case. It is very similar, and this is kind of dealing with Thomas Jefferson saying bad things about a dude named Callender, and he's calling John Adams a hoary-headed incendiary, and all these things. So if speaking to my Hamilton the Musical fans out there, you know that these two bickered quite a lot, and so this is kind of bringing some of that in. So if you like to teach with that musical, then this would be a good thing to use. But this is Hamilton's notes from the case. He has this cut out, and it's glued into this larger manuscript of bits and pieces, and it says Croswell next to it, so we know that that's what this is talking about. But then he himself is going back and he's summarizing the main points that he took away from that. And so the first point, and this is just a transcript of what his handwriting is over here, the liberty of the press consists in the right to publish with impunity truth, with good motives for justifiable ends through reflecting on government majesty on individuals. So this is actually a bit limited here. He's putting a limit on the idea of what the press can say. He's saying good motives for justifiable ends through reflecting on government majesty on individuals. So he's actually introducing a bit of a leash here, and a loophole for further cases. But in any case, so these are supposed to not take up a whole lot of time. I read through all of it so that you won't have to. But again, this idea that you want students to get out is what do these say about the freedom of the press in the United States, both right before its founding and right after its founding? Does the actual experience of having achieved independence from Great Britain change the way we talk about the freedom of the press? And actually not so much. And so it's kind of interesting, and it makes you think about what are some of the roots of this idea of a free press. Certainly they go back earlier than the John Peter Zenger case. And there's an interesting chronology of that in the at this website. And again, Kira's going to show you, tell you a bit more about that website a little bit later. So yes, that is basically supposed to tie in some early American history with history of the printing press itself, and how that can actually, that, you know, that is the main technology by which these kinds of things are disseminated, and the importance of things being printed on paper in terms of informing people and changing public opinion. And, you know, literacy in the United States is going to increase quite a bit during the 18th century. And so what do you do when you have more and more people reading these papers? Like, does the government have a right to control what they read? And, you know, the answer is no. So that's just kind of a bit of an introduction to the idea of this free press that is going to get further explored in some of our other things that we have. So at this point now, Kira, do I turn it over to October?
Yes.
Are we going to jump forward to the 20th century now?
Yes, we are.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn everything over to October now.
Thank you. So I'm just going to be sharing with y'all a quick look at one of the cool press things that the Library of Congress has on Japanese internment. And just for a quick background on Japanese internment, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor during World War II, signed in the Executive Order 9066, which gave authorization for the police to relocate any and all persons from military areas. And although this wasn't used, didn't specify any specific racial or ethnic group, it was mostly used to move Japanese Americans out of the West Coast, so in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, which were all declared military areas in 1942. So between 1942 and 1945, Japanese Americans in those three states were moved to were moved into military internment camps. And we have an entire lesson idea on that in this newsletter for this month that looks at how mainstream press covered or really didn't cover Japanese internment. But something that we found this month in the Library of Congress was newspapers created by Japanese Americans who were in internment camps at the time that give a better look of how their everyday life happened. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show you guys where that's at in the Library of Congress. Okay, so here we are on the Library of Congress's homepage. If you just scroll down to digital collections, and then they have hundreds. So we're just going to search within the digital collections. It's this one right here, Japanese American internment camp newspapers. And so they have an entire collection from 1942 to 1946 of different newspapers that were created in these assembly centers and relocation centers. And I just picked out a couple that I thought were really cool because there's a bunch of them in here. So this issue is an anniversary issue from the Manzanar Free Press newspaper. It was from the Manzanar camp in California. So they had been printing the newspaper for 1 year, and they did a special anniversary edition that includes a poem, which I thought was really cool. So a poem on what it was like being in the Manzanar camp for that year. They also had quotes from people who were in the camp about what it was like being in the camp, and just a lot of reflections on what that 1 year has looked like at Manzanar. So I thought this anniversary issue, along with some of the images that they have of what it looked like to be in the camp, was really interesting. I also found this one from the Tulunian Dispatch, which was also in California, in Newell, California. And they have an entire poem on loyalty in this edition of their newspaper from 1943 about still considering themselves to be American citizens, even though they were kind of betrayed. I mean, not kind of, they were betrayed by their American government and put in internment camps. Because a lot of these Japanese Americans were second generation Americans born in America, not in Japan. And still they were put in these prison-like camps because they couldn't be trusted to be American citizens. So I found this very interesting that a lot of them still did consider themselves to be American citizens and wrote about it in their newspapers. And then the last one that I picked out to show was also from the Tulunian Dispatch. And I just thought this was cool to show the many different types of media that they included in their newspapers. So this newspaper from 1943 showed a drawing of what it was like to live in the Newell camp. So I thought these, again, we have an entire lesson plan on how mainstream media didn't really cover a lot of what happened in these Japanese internment camps. In fact, if you didn't live on the West Coast, most people didn't even know about Japanese internment. And so this really does give a really good look at what everyday life looked like for Japanese Americans, because they had access to create their own media, their own press, and their own material culture. So I think it'd be great to study in classes since you don't get that from everyday mainstream press. And I'm going to turn over to Kira, who's going to show you even more resources that you can use to teach about the press in your classes.
Thank you, October. And if you're interested in using that collection, I know that there are a couple of different folks that I have seen kind of doing different conferences that, were children who were actually interred, and they, have kind of shared their experiences. And so I feel like that would be good to find some of those talks, and so you could actually juxtapose those oral histories and people kind of sharing their memories with what is being shared in those newspapers, because it'd be really interesting to see again how life is presented in those newspapers versus what people remember, having experienced in their childhood. All right, so thank you for sharing that. So I want to share with you guys a couple of other things that we found. Again, and some of this I think may be new, or at least new to us. So let me find the right window here. The first one I want to share with you guys, and again, I think this was one that's new to us. And this is the First Amendment Encyclopedia. And this is actually housed at MTSU. It's presented through the John Siegenthaler Chair of Excellence in First Amendment Studies. And this encyclopedia is a really great resource, again, for secondary information to help summarize and contextualize some of these things. And so you can read more about the encyclopedia here, kind of get a sense of who's involved with it and how it's organized. And then once you get to this listing, you see there's a table of contents. There's also a short essay at the very beginning that was written by John Siegenthaler on how the First Amendment came to be. So again, this would be really good if you are teaching a government course or if you are also doing kind of early American history. The table of contents, you can see, you can look at it via either article or topics. And so with the topics list, you see it's broken down, controversial works, documents, events, and so on. And so let's see here. So we'll look here at presidents. And so you can see here, you can click on any of these, and then you would be able to see, the article for them and kind of, again, their connection into the First Amendment and fights around that. So again, it's a really great secondary source that's out there. I highly recommend taking a look at it. The other thing that I wanted to show you guys, so like the collection that October was just sharing with us, there's a really great collection of newspaper clippings from World War I. And that can be found here, and it is one of the things listed on our page 2 in the links there. So this has, again, just clippings, so it's not going to be the full papers. So again, if you're looking for things from that period, this is a good cross section to look at. And then something else that we haven't used frequently before, although it was presented to us at a Library of Congress consortium meeting a long time ago, is the Congressional Research Services. And a few years ago, they began digitizing their reports. Now, I know I wasn't familiar with what the Congressional Research Services was. And so your students probably aren't familiar with it either. And so essentially this is the department that does all of the research and writes the reports for the legislative branch. And so if there is a question that a particular member of Congress or committee has, this is the department that they go to begin to research and answer those questions. And so you can actually access all of their reports here through this site right here, which is connected through the congress.gov site. And so we can see here, it's going to pull up all of the reports they have that connect to the First Amendment. And so you can see, again, this is going to be a lot of, there's a lot of current stuff that's here, but you can find things, from, more than just kind of current events. So again, I would highly recommend taking a look at this. And again, this is probably not something maybe that you as the teacher would want to excerpt for your students. If you're working with high school, you might be able to work with your students to kind of work through some of this. But for our, let me pull it up so you guys can see it. Are you guys seeing the newsletter now on my screen? Okay, so in the lesson idea that I did on the fairness doctrine, because again, this is something that maybe students have heard some about. There's a lot of kind of more recent, and when I recent, I mean by like, 80s, 90s and forward. So there is a really good report that you can read on the fairness doctrine that the Congressional Research Services did on the foundations of the fairness doctrine. And so you can read the overview that's in that, again, give students a good summary of some of those pieces that will then help them to understand some of the legal cases, and specifically the legal case in this Red Lion broadcasting company versus the FCC. And so again, it's a really good place to go and be able to pull some of those documents, and also just to give students a sense of the information that our congressional members and the committees, essentially the information our government works with. So it's a really good source that's out there. One other thing that we wanted to bring up here within our important links box. So again, I mentioned the World War I newspapers that are listed here. Actually, that's this one. There is also the Stars and Stripes, which is the newspaper that is printed actually through the military. And so you have those available from World War I as well. That's linked in here. And it's going to be another good World War I source. And then something new that the library has put together is an analysis guide for analyzing newspapers. And so there's a little blog article that's linked here that kind of talks about that new guide. And then you also see here there's a link to where you can go and find that document. So what that is essentially, this analysis sheet that many of you are probably very familiar with. but again, designed to analyze newspapers. And so the questions here are going to help students to be able to think about, again, like what are we seeing as far as the way the headlines are written, what stories and topics are situated where on the paper. Again, this is a really good guide to kind of helping them to be able to analyze a newspaper, kind of like a front page or even a newspaper as a whole. So this is a great new piece that the library has up on its site. So I definitely would recommend taking a look at that. So I think that was the main things that I wanted to bring out to you guys. Of course, we do have a couple lesson plans that we have mentioned here that are from our TPS-MTSU site. We did one that was written by a teacher in Davidson County on the media and 20th century race riots. This one specifically looks at a comparison between coverage of the Tulsa race riots and then what happened in Colombia just prior to the civil rights movement in the late 40s. So this is, again, it's a really good lesson plan looking at kind of how those two different events were covered in the press and gives you a chance to kind of see how media was covering those events and how that again changed during that period of time. And then we did a lesson idea a couple years ago, I think now, on some famous Black journalists that were here in the state. And I believe, if I remember correctly, this one touches on Ida B. Wells and I'm not going to remember the guy's name. He was in Chattanooga. But there is a fabulous documentary that Nashville Public Television did that's actually linked into this lesson idea on the Black press, especially specifically in Tennessee. And so again, that's linked there. It's a great documentary, and I believe that that one is still available for free online, that you can watch that. So at this point, I think, unless, am I forgetting something that I should talk about, Stacy?
There were just two additional things I wanted to mention just because they didn't have room. We also have another another lesson plan that was created by a Nashville teacher on muckraking during the progressive era. That's available if you go to our our lesson plans tab and you click on progressive era. Scroll down, I think it's at the bottom, it's Victor Bright's. So talking about photojournalism in particular. So that's another teacher created thing that we have that involves the idea of the free press. And then lastly, can I, since we do have like a minute, can I show them the chronology on the First Amendment Encyclopedia, because I just like it so much, the way that it's kind of set up.
Yeah, please do, because when looking at it, I didn't see that, but again, that site is new to me.
Oh, yeah, well, that's the thing. I've heard of the John Siegenthaler Chair of Excellence in First Amendment Studies, and we do work on a very large campus, so we don't know everything that's going on. But I didn't realize that this site was this extensive, and I had never used it before this newsletter. And so I am so glad to be able to have another place to go and just find really great articles. But basically, if you go to Encyclopedia you can see this, right? Okay, good. You scroll down, it's actually under chronology. And I haven't really been able to explore this too deeply, but I mean, look, it starts with the Emperor Constantine extending toleration to religions and a religion to Christianity. And I'm like, wow, now that's some deep context that we're establishing here in terms of tolerating views that don't necessarily align with the establishment. And then, of course, skipping to Magna Carta, Martin Luther, what's going on in England that's going to end up being very influential on the early American colonies. So there's a lot of stuff to kind of build that in. So this is something definitely that 7th and 8th grade teachers will overlap in terms of time span. And also the high school teachers who teach, other subjects other than just the traditional American history survey. But yeah, so you can see, here we have the John Peter Zenger trial, but then we have other things going on pretty extensively at that time as well. And so it just keeps going on and on and on. So it's incredibly detailed. And I'll stop sharing, but each of these will link to their article within this encyclopedia. So it's very extensive and very easy to read. And it would be the perfect kind of context to give to your high school and even your middle school students in terms of like reading levels and stuff. I think it'll be very accessible for them. And they're written by experts in the field. Like I think a couple of the ones that I read were actually written by John Weil, who's Dean of the Honors College here at MTSU, whom I met before. So yeah, that was a lot of this stuff, as Kira mentioned, a lot of these collections and sites were new to us. So that's one thing that we really love about these newsletters is how much we learn when we're trying to help you teach your students new things. It's just, that's what makes these so interesting. I mean, why else would I be reading a 33-page long PDF in 18th century newsprint, So, but anyway, okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Kira for some closing up details. I think we're going to get out a little bit early today.
Yeah, so let me again bring up. All right, so again, just a reminder, you can find links to, for example, the encyclopedia we just showed, as well as the newsletter on our Padlet page. We are also, slide to advance, we're going to give away a book today. And actually, I'm going to switch it over. I need to share the screen with October so that she can bring up our wheel. And so for folks who are participating live, we've got you entered on our list. And we're going to be giving away, let's see, pull up the name of the book we're giving away. We're going to give away a copy of Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong by James Loewen.
Yeah, so let me share my screen with y'all so we can spin the wheel and see who wins a book. Okay, make sure everyone is on there before I spin so it's equal opportunity. Okay.
Right, so Joanne is our winner. Joanne, if you would send us your mailing address and we will get that book sent out to you. So again, thank you for joining us today. The last things that we want to share with you guys is, of course, a reminder that we do love your feedback. We have a short survey, and if you will take just a moment to fill that out, it really does help us as we think about topics to cover in the future. And as we think about, of course, planning this webinar for after the first of the year. Also, if you've not already done so, we have another survey that we've been doing, kind of just collecting people's input on resources, things that you would like to see us do in the spring. We are not anticipating doing in-person events again until probably the summer. So we do want to hear from you guys, again, what we can be offering you in the spring that would be helpful. So we'll drop the links for both of those in the chat. So again, if you would fill out the survey for today, and then that feedback survey also would be very helpful for us. And you can also find the link for the survey for the end of today's session on our Padlet as well, and you can fill it out there. Again, thank you guys for joining us today. We are going to be doing one more for 2020, and that is going to take place on what date that is. I believe it is December the 10th. That is going to be also at 4 o'clock, and our topic for next month is going to be using graphic media in the classroom. So we'll also have some great images to show, and so that'll be a real fun topic for us to explore further. And we'll leave this open, of course, if you guys have questions, just stick on, but we're going to go ahead and close out and stop our recording. And again, thank you guys for joining us today.